President, ladies and gentlemen, or Ursula, dear Ursula, I think you need to hear in a straightforward way what most Europeans think about you. Choosing you to be the president of the European Commission in the previous term of office was a great mistake, and some still have a hangover because of it. You destroy the European economy and agriculture. Us Europeans are becoming poorer and poorer because of you. You are the face of the Migration Pact, and I'm talking to you as a woman to a woman, as a mother to a mother. How can you not be ashamed of promoting the Migration Pact, which means that millions of women and children in Europe feel endangered, threatened on the streets of their cities? This is what we think about this. This is what we think about the Migration Pact. You're not even looking at me. That's a shame. We want a Europe of free and sovereign nations and not a sick leftist ideology.
So, those were the strong words of the Polish MEP, Ewa Hernik. Words that would have seldom been heard in the EU Parliament at the turn of the millennium, but nonetheless words that resonate very loudly today. The Polish government have stated that they will take 0 people passing via the Mediterranean, with the public actually voting emphatically against it. Hungary has also delivered a similar sentiment. The Brussels-based expert Peter Klepp has acknowledged this disenchantment, and also the growth of MEPs and parties hostile to the European Union. This isn't just the widely known figures, so people like Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, Marine Le Pen in France, or Viktor Orban in Hungary. It's actually a huge number of MEPs from all over the European Union: Poland, Sweden, Austria, Belgium, or Estonia. Skepticism towards the EU is becoming ever more widespread, but there appears to be a common denominator. Established corporations, the political class, and big business tend to like the European Union, generally speaking. But the mass of people are distrusting it less and less. But before I go any further, there is, however, an elephant in the room: the UK.
Well, at 20 minutes to 5, we can now say the decision taken in 1975 by this country to join the common market has been reversed by this referendum to leave the EU. British people have spoken, and the answer is we're out.
The UK is actually a country that has actually voted to leave the EU, and after a lot of delay did leave. But in the eyes of many, it seems this decision made little difference in quelling public anxiety on the issues that hastened it. So, given the UK has left the EU, but hasn't resolved the key issues that people rallied against it for, it might seem odd that skepticism of the EU is still growing on the continent. So, I'm sorry, but that does mean that we're going to have to go over Brexit, because it is an important aside, and it also gives me a chance to go over the EU's inception and Britain's rocky path in it for context. So yeah, let's have a look at that. The European Union initially started out as the European Economic Community, or the EEC, in 1957. The general idea behind the project at the time was to eliminate trade barriers and to allow for common trade across the various member states. It was also hoped, and certainly intended, that the project would help reduce tensions that had arisen up to and during World War II. The feeling at the time was that nations that collaborated with each other and traded with each other would be less likely to go to war. The UK actually opted out of joining initially, but 6 countries did sign up, and the community got off to a good start, actually enjoying greater prosperity than the UK. And it was this in part that led to a change of heart within the UK, with subsequent British Prime Ministers actually making it their goal to get Britain inside the market. 2 UK Prime Ministers, Harold Macmillan in 1963 and Harold Wilson in 1967, actually had their applications to join rejected by France's General de Gaulle, meaning the UK didn't actually join until 1973 under the former Conservative Prime Minister Edward Heath. Shortly after this, Edward Heath's opponent Harold Wilson won power, and many in his party had reservations about Britain's place in the market, so that left him with a tricky problem. And in a bid to quell party disunity, he offered a referendum in 1975 on whether Britain was to remain in Europe or leave. and that was predicated on Wilson renegotiating Britain's terms within the market. The changes he made were entirely superficial, but they did allow him to recommend to the country that Britain remain in the market, while also allowing his party to freely advocate their own views. And that actually meant that many well-known figures within the party who opposed membership, such as Tony Benn, Michael Foot or Barbara Castle, were actually left free to make their views known on the air, and they did.
Give up don't put words like that. But cut the umbilical cord that links the lawmakers with the people, and you destroy the stability of this country.
You are asking the British people now
to destroy
take
democracy.
a terribly disrupted decision
To destroy
at a time of
parliamentary
great
democracy.
fragility for
They lured us into the market with the mirage of the market miracle.
Holding these views as passionately and sincerely as she does, may we assume that if the vote is yes, she would not stay on to administer those policies as a minister?
If the vote goes yes, my country will need me to save it.
The arguments made weren't too dissimilar from those of today, but at the time the market was just that, a market. And this was a time before globalisation, a time when high manufacturing tariffs were still the norm. So many seeing a clear economical benefit to actually joining, and tied to this was the shadow of war. Something still firmly in the minds of the people at the time. One tagline for Remain was even, better lose a little sovereignty than a son or a daughter. So even if we forget the financial disparity between the well-organised and well-funded in campaign, and the thrown together out campaign, it ultimately came as little surprise to many at the time that the UK overwhelmingly voted to stay in. Membership was shown to offer easier access to trade and more security, and the argument for peace and stability was far more compelling than the argument for sovereignty.
They think it's all over.
These issues, the issues concerning ease of trade and peace, were the central issues nations sought membership of the market. Jean Monnet, often considered one of the architects of the EU, once stated, "As long as Europe remains fragmented, it will remain weak and a constant source of conflict." Now, I'm not sure how much this rhetoric actually resonated at the time, but any skepticism towards the project would have been eased by the fact that the common market initially wasn't that powerful. It was a market, so it was about trade, and at the time there were high manufacturing tariffs, so there were economical benefits at the time. The difference between the 1970s and 2016 is that the European Union had become, through a series of treaties, a political union. The European Communities Act of 1972 and the Human Rights Act of 1998 effectively acted as a matrix into which every other law must fit. If a law didn't fit, then Parliament could actually find themselves in court. A well-known example is a court in Strasbourg stopping the UK from deporting Abu Qatada. So if not even this was permitted, what hope was there in controlling borders, not to mention the backlog of some 160,000 cases? It's these constraints that nations don't like and that are now causing the EU issues across the continent. Arguably, the EU had actually attained the power it does have, without a mandate from the people. It is true to say that several EU treaties have actually been implemented against the will of the people. Referenda in France, the Netherlands, Ireland, which resulted in problematic votes for the European Union, with people actually voting to stop integration with the project, were ignored. This was also the case in Denmark. So whether integration was actually desired or not, the behaviour of the EU was increasingly questioned. And is increasingly questioned today. Now, the fallout here is that the UK has actually left the EU. So the country has gone through all the disruption, but nothing's changed. Now, this isn't down to the vote itself. It's actually down to the UK Parliaments people have elected since. It was actually the UK Parliament that lowered the barriers to entry that even Migration Watch acknowledged would mean larger numbers of people moving. So while the decision to leave the EU may have given Parliament the power to deal with these issues, the Parliament that was elected didn't want to. Leaving the EU wasn't something Parliament, the civil service, business or trade unions wanted, and the Foreign Office civil servant Alicia Kearns admitted that the civil service was in large part against it. So in short, very little changed. The vote only gave the nation more right to self-determination. It didn't decide how the nation would actually govern itself. Having said that, the UK leaving has at the very least given a green light that it is possible to leave without a country falling off a cliff. French politician Charles-Henri Gallois said talking about Brexit being a failure is crassly dishonest. Analyse the growth figures and you will see that since Brexit, the UK has done better than the Eurozone. If it's a disaster in the UK, it's the apocalypse in the Eurozone. This is because while outlooks aren't great on either side, the UK economy has at least been growing faster than France or Germany. And inflation is variable, but it's certainly not the disaster which was predicted, and in some EU states, inflation has actually been much higher. And this is important because during the campaign for Britain to leave, it was widely reported that families would be over £4,000 worse off. And since this time, the Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, has actually admitted that those dire warnings were wrong and that they were actually attempted to scare the public. And the reason why that actually carries weight is because the one card the EU had, and still has to an extent, was the argument on stability. Things like stability, jobs and the economy is what keeps people in. Generally speaking, the distrust that's growing now is more to do with the EU ideology. I stated earlier that Poland voted 98.6% against the migrant quotas, and that Hungary had delivered a similar sentiment. But while they are voting overwhelmingly, they are also subject to the EU's forced relocation plan. And these nations in Eastern Europe are now looking to Western Europe, where violent crime is now on average far higher. In Denmark, for example, regarding violent crime convictions, native-born Danes come all the way down at number 43. So while terrorism is becoming a huge issue in France, for example, it isn't becoming a huge issue in Poland. And as a consequence, the EU has found itself in turmoil with various member states, whether they're taking Hungary to court, attempting to strip nations of voting rights, or aiding the shutting down of entire media broadcasters, as we've seen in Poland. In this regard, it seems the more traditional Eastern Europe is a particular target at the moment. Robert Oels, the director of the think tank based in London, Bruges Group, has since stated, quote, "The EU clique has for several years been attacking the governments of Eastern Europe. We need to understand the attacks on Orban as part of a wider move to quash independent nation-states in Eastern Europe. One of the issues is their refusal to take migrants that arrived in Germany." He also noted their attacks on Hungary's pro-natalist, pro-marriage policies, and acknowledged that nations wishing to protect their cultures and values are now finding themselves at odds with the EU. He went on to state, "It's basically a case of European liberals trying to remove Hungary's voting rights in the European Council, which violates the principle of unanimity, one of the last vestiges of national sovereignty held by EU member states, simply because Hungary doesn't subscribe to the prevailing anti-democratic orthodoxy in Brussels." So, take from that what you will, but I think it's compelling, and his words certainly don't appear to be undermined by voting trends in Europe. The EU appears to be aware of the growing disenchantment that has only grown since the UK exited the Union, and consequently, President Ursula von der Leyen is now supporting policies she once ridiculed in a bid to quell the unease. Interestingly, the EU has also tried to take on the argument for democracy and to argue that they are actually defending it against states or movements with autocratic tendencies. But while there are many good defenders of the EU, this is an argument they are struggling to win. The main issue the EU has here is that it has to accept that it has, at its core, a commission which is entirely unelected and has, as we've discussed on several occasions, ignored the votes of the majority. The current Czech Commissioner of the EU actually recently wanted to punish Poland and Hungary for what she perceives as their anti-democratic actions. Imagine for a second you are a bureaucrat. You receive a great deal of wealth via the taxpayer. You've got power, and lots of it, but you're also someone who hasn't subjected yourself to an election for your own mandate. So no one has elected you, and no one can remove you. and you are lecturing a man with millions of votes behind him on democratic rights. Regardless of the nature of the argument, this action is not, in any classic sense, protecting democracy. It's more akin to protecting a consensus from democratic change. If Poland has voted against the migrant quotas mandated by the EU, the fact that it's forced into talks which propose the charging of €22,000 for each person they refuse isn't really helping save democracy. But again, it's economics which the EU has to stop nations rebelling too much. And the ability to withhold money if countries don't comply with what they want. It's also important not to forget that the market itself is something nations, particularly in Central Europe, do not want to turn away from. So again, it makes sense that back when Britain held its referendum, the Remain camp went for the economic argument, knowing that fear of the unknown and disruption and economic consequences are what would most likely and understandably shift a person's vote. So the movement in the EU today takes account of this. Nations are fighting the EU from within and rebelling against it. It's unlikely that the EU will seek to diminish its power, though I would personally welcome it if it did. And at the same time, security will become a much greater concern for the industrialised world in the years ahead. And as security becomes of greater concern, people will demand more control, at the very time it appears to be taken away from them. And this isn't just from the EU. Another example could be the World Health Organization's pandemic treaty proposal. A proposal that, if passed, could in essence give the WHO the power to enforce lockdowns. And even within the nation itself, there are internal power constraints. The fallout regarding the European Union is that a majority of people still support trade and still support doctors sharing best practice via the WHO. And a majority of people value cooperation and value alliances, and in many cases see it as necessary for the modern world. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those alliances should override self-determination. And in that regard, the EU itself is a main barrier, as it constrains what a nation can do. These constraints and concerns were not clear at the start. So trade and cooperation was accepted to a large degree, and expansion of the EU came later when the former Eastern Bloc countries sought to be embedded in the Western structures with the promise of investment. And thankfully there has been a lot of merit to this, but the question as to whether a trade bloc equals full political union and the right to tell a nation state how to govern itself, even if it wants to join, is another matter altogether. This is where this video at least would argue the divide is coming from. So I'll leave it there for now. I hope you got something out of it. Bye for now. Take care.